All right, thank you, everyone. Super excited to be here. So the workshop today is and Wednesday is AI for the empirical legal scholar. I'm gonna see if I can. No, I think I lose the mic if I do that. Okay, I'll sit. AI for the empirical legal scholar. So what I'm going to do, we'll spend maybe a half hour, 45 minutes now. I'm going to basically talk through kind of broadly empirical legal studies as well as the way that it's been changing with machine learning and AI and what kinds of things that you should be thinking about as well if you want to integrate this into your own work. After I talk for 30, 45 minutes, I'll take some questions, and then we'll actually do for the rest of today and then on Wednesday, some coding exercises. So I've actually put together a notebook. So we're going to learn to apply some of the things that I'm going to talk about here, and hopefully it's enough to get you started on your own projects as well. Like I said, happy to take any questions both throughout this or at the very end of this, whatever you prefer. And then when we're doing coding exercises, that'll be quite interactive. So looking forward to hearing from all of you as well. So to start, like I said, what I want to do is just talk to you about AI in empirical legal studies. What we're going to do is basically start from the beginning, at the base floor, kind of move up from there. One argument that I will make is that you probably see a lot about AI at the Law and Tech Center. I'm sure you think a lot about AI governance and regulation. For all purposes, I kind of think of AI as some extension of machine learning. Basically, we're trying to make really accurate predictions about something. So using that as the premise, we're going to build up and see what is it? What is machine learning? What is machine learning using text? And then what is AI on top of all of this? So we're going to go through some of that. And again, later today, and Wednesday, you're going to see how to actually apply some of this, how you can actually do this with some of your own data sets or on questions that you're interested in. So we'll do that. We'll do some hands-on demos. And again, happy to take questions throughout or at the end, whatever you prefer. Okay, so to start, what is empirical legal studies? So I don't know how much you guys do empirical work or if you're just kind of interested in learning about it, but starting from the very beginning, here what I have is a table from an article from 1957. So Robert Dahl was a very famous political scientist, did a lot of things, studied democracy, studied political institutions in the US, really started some of these kinds of trends about quantitatively measuring how institutions behave. So he had a famous article back in the day, Decision Making in a Democracy, the Supreme Court as a National Policy Maker. At that time in 1957, what he did was a study where he went through the US Supreme Court's decisions over a 20-year period, and he went ahead and counted up how many times does the US Supreme Court hold New Deal legislation unconstitutional versus how often does it hold other types of legislation unconstitutional. So these days, this would be pretty basic. We would, this is pretty easy to do for us nowadays. Back then, this was seen as something kind of revolutionary to actually sit and quantitatively measure something and describe something with statistics instead of just thinking through doctrine or theory alone. So it's been about 70 some odd years or almost 70 years since this paper came out. But this spirit, I would say, still lives in a lot of what we do, even today, using AI to empirically study different legal questions. So at a basic level, what we're doing is trying to use data to tackle certain kinds of legal questions. And these days, we move beyond what Robert Dahl was doing, just simply counting things up oftentimes, to instead trying to do things like make inferences and predictions. So what he was doing by counting up the number of pieces of legislation that are turned unconstitutional, that was largely descriptive. We're trying to learn some facts about the world, and we're trying to present them. We're trying to say something about this is how the world actually is. A lot of the tools that we use for that today will be used plots, histograms, bar plots, pie charts, things like that. We'll use a lot of tables to show these kinds of things. So a lot of that work can be descriptive, and we still do that today, and it'll still be part of any good empirical legal studies paper. But beyond that, we do a couple of other things as well. Increasingly, as legal social scientists, we're interested in inference or causal inference. We want to make claims about how X affects Y. If I pass a law, what is the effect of that law on some outcome? So trying to make inferences about what a law does or about these kinds of legal questions or institutional questions, that is a huge part of what we do empirically. The other bit, and the one that I'm going to focus on mainly today, is the idea of prediction. That I'm not as concerned about how X causes Y or affects Y, but instead I'm just interested in predicting something. I want to see how X predicts Y. This is where we talk about machine learning, AI, text analysis, etc. So again, at a broad level, you could think of empirical work in these three buckets: descriptive, inferential, and predictive. As you get further and further into this, you'll see that these three oftentimes come together in various ways. One paper might have elements of all of these in it. We might use prediction to support some causal inference and vice versa. But these are three big ways to kind of think about it. And AI in particular is really focused on this kind of prediction aspect. Can I create models that are able to make really good predictions, really accurate predictions that would have been very difficult before? So thinking about AI and law specifically, one thing that I want you to take out of today is the idea of law as data. So one of the exciting developments about machine learning and AI and how it affects empirical legal studies, again, thinking back to what Robert Dahl was doing, he was sitting, reading Supreme Court opinions and literally saying, okay, this one's held the law is unconstitutional, this one did not. This one was about New Deal legislation, this one did not. Very simple kind of counting things up. One of the exciting things for us today is that with these new computational methods, we do a lot more than just counting up things like this. We can actually treat law as a source of data itself. So if you saw in the abstract for this workshop, one of the arguments that I am making to you, and one of the exciting things about AI is the idea that we can move beyond just numbers or just things that are easily quantified into thinking of other things as data as well. So that can include the text of legal opinions or contracts or corporate disclosures. It can include images like trademarked logos or courtroom videos or pictures of various other things. It can also include audio. Various sorts of different data sources can actually count as data for the purpose of empirical legal studies. So trying to treat the law not just as numbers that we count up, but also as a source of data itself, both to make predictions about something out in the world and as the object of study, is a really interesting kind of move that is happening right now in empirical legal studies. So on the slide here, I have a book that came out a few years ago. This is an edited volume. I highly recommend it if you're interested in this topic as a way to kind of get exposed to, it's a couple years out of date now, but get exposed to some of the thinking around using law as a source of data. So it's literally called Law as Data, Computation, Text, and the Future of Legal Analysis. It's a series of essays basically trying to say how machine learning is going to change the way that we do empirical legal studies in the future. So what does this look like in practice? I'm going to go through a couple of papers that show you some of the techniques and how these get applied to a variety of different questions within empirical legal studies. For example, starting with the idea of machine learning, one of the main types of machine learning is something called supervised machine learning. Here, the question is, I have some features X, I want to predict some kind of outcome Y. This can get separated into two different things. It could be either classification. I'm trying to predict a category that an observation belongs to. Something is a 1 or a 0. It's constitutional or unconstitutional, for example. Or it could be multi-class. I'm trying to predict many different things, 3 or more. I'm trying to predict, for example, what category a consumer complaint falls into. And we're going to see some of these examples in practice as well. Or maybe I'm trying to predict if someone is high or low income. Just are you high income or are you low income? The other type of supervised machine learning is regression. So if you've had a basic stats course, you might have run into this idea of linear regression. So here, what we're trying to do is predict a continuous number. So for example, can I predict someone's exact income in dollars instead of just are they high or low income? So this supervised machine learning is probably what a lot of people are thinking about when they say ML. What they basically mean is, can I make a prediction on some category or of some number? Can I do classification? Can I do regression? So again, if you've had a basic stats course, these are not actually too different from some of the methods and models that you've seen before. What really is different is the framework that we're working in, that what we're doing with machine learning is trying to make the most accurate predictions possible rather than trying to draw some inference or some conclusion about the relationship between some variables and some outcome. So to make it a little bit more concrete for you, in about an hour or so, we're going to work with this data set here. This is the US Census data set, which is oftentimes used in kind of intro machine learning courses. So here, like I said, what the task might be is trying to predict that last column there, income bracket. Are you less than or equal to $50,000, or do you make more than $50,000? Are you low income or high income? And maybe what I want to do is make a model that's able to predict that based on how old you are, based on whether you work for the state or whether you work in industry, how many years of education you have, your marital status, any features like this. So again, the idea is, can I predict some outcome Y, that income bracket, low income or high income, based on all of these features X, your race, your employment status, your age, things like this. This is the heart of supervised machine learning. And again, it can look very similar to things you might have seen before. It may be totally new, but fundamentally, that is what we're doing. How does this now then get applied in modern empirical legal studies? So one of my colleagues, or a couple of my colleagues, Elliot Ash, Sergio Gaeta, have done a paper recently. I think it's coming out in the next couple of months now, titled "A Machine Learning Approach to Analyze and Support Anti-Corruption Policy." So here they start with a basic problem. They say, let me try and move this so I can see. Okay. They start with a basic policy problem. They say that municipal governments in Brazil oftentimes can be corrupt. You can have a mayor, you can have a town council, something like this, that collects taxes but doesn't send it all back to the federal government or to the state government. Someone pockets the money or they accept bribes. They do things like this. So this is a big problem. The federal government routinely does audits to make sure that municipal ledgers look the way that they're supposed to. They basically want to make sure that all the money is accounted for. The issue is that it's really expensive to do these, and it takes quite a bit of time to do an audit of a municipality. Someone needs to come in, they need to look at the books, they need to make sure everything adds up that way. How can we so what should the federal government actually do to make these audits as efficient as possible? The question in this paper is, can machine learning be used to predict corrupt municipalities based on these budget variables? So for example, inflows, outflows of taxes, how long it took to file certain paperwork, features like this. They basically use what's called a tree-based method, random forest. If that doesn't mean anything, don't worry. But they basically use a machine learning model to go ahead and predict which municipalities are corrupt. And again, they do this and they show that with pretty good accuracy, they could figure out which municipalities should be audited for potential corruption. So again, it's a interesting paper, potentially sounds complicated, but it's not too different from what we will do later today, where we've set up a model and we're trying to predict, are you low income or are you high income? Very, very similarly, is this municipality corrupt or is it not corrupt? Very similar, and it does not take a lot of coding expertise to actually go at this problem. What it does take is an intuition of the kind of policy issues, as well as understanding how to set up and frame this kind of problem. But you will see that if this is the sort of thing that interests you, that the computation and the code should not be the thing that potentially scares you off from it. So besides supervised learning, there's also something called unsupervised learning. So unlike these previous examples where you have some Y that you're trying to predict, some target that you know that you want to try and predict, there's nothing really labeled here. Instead, what you're doing is you have a ton of data and you're trying to find patterns in it. You'll use what are called clustering algorithms or other similar techniques to see if you can group data together in interesting ways. And this then becomes useful later on. So we'll talk about this, especially when we go to text analysis. But these are the two major types of machine learning, supervised and unsupervised. Supervised is all about, I have some label Y that I want to predict. Can I do that accurately? Unsupervised is I have a bunch of data. I don't really have any labels, but I want to find some patterns. Can I use it to find some patterns? So this has been a really interesting kind of development in empirical legal studies, I would say over the last 10, maybe 15 years, the use of both supervised and unsupervised methods to basically figure out at scale, we have large data sets. Oftentimes they can be really complicated. Can we do something interesting, and can we do something that's enabled by computers? The fact that we have these new techniques, can we do something like predict corruption or predict income? Problems like this. Any questions so far? Okay, great. So moving on from basic machine learning, the other really exciting aspect of AI for empirical legal studies has been the growth of text analysis. I would say that text analysis shares a lot of its DNA with basic machine learning. The main difference mainly comes in the fact that whereas when you have zeros and ones, you have numbers, computers know how to understand these. Text is a little bit different. It needs to be processed in some way, represented numerically, so that it can actually be understood by a computer and then fed to a machine learning model. But the same basic framework still applies. You have supervised problems where you're trying to predict something, and you have unsupervised problems where you're trying to find some structure, find some patterns. And that's true in text as well. We might be trying to use text to predict some kind of outcome, or we might actually be trying to predict text itself, or we're just trying to look for patterns in text that could be potentially interesting and informative on their own. So here, some of the tools and techniques include things like topic modeling, word embeddings. We will get to it in a little bit with generative AI as well. But we will see mostly on Wednesday how we can actually build up from the basic building blocks of how do I take a piece of text and represent it as a number, all the way into how do generative AI models like ChatGPT or Gemini or DeepSeek actually use these similar techniques to do a lot of the cool stuff that you have probably seen or probably used it for yourself. How do we move from just representing text as numbers into some of these really interesting applications? So an example of a paper that does a little bit of text analysis is another forthcoming one by Jens Frankenreiter, Talia Gillis, and Eric Talley called Sex and Startups. Here, the authors ask a question: does venture capital charter language predict whether a startup is male or female founded? So within corporate law, there's some interest in making sure that there's diversity in corporate boards, within startup founders, things like this. So they basically ask, A, does the language of a founding charter for a company, does it predict whether or not the founder is male or female led? And they have some interesting sub questions in there as well. Do male and female led startups get different kinds of terms and conditions placed on their venture capital? Do they get more or less venture capital when a venture capitalist invests in them? All of these kinds of questions to basically get at diversity in the startup world. So here, what they do is they try and see, does the text of these charter documents predict who's the gender of the founder? So they use text analysis to find these patterns. They basically use things like topic modeling and these kinds of clustering algorithms to turn the text into features and combine that with supervised machine learning to do this prediction of, is this a male founder or a female founder? And they get some interesting results where they're able to predict the female founder companies with fairly high accuracy. So here, again, it's an interesting example of you have text that has always been part of corporate law, for example. Corporate law requires a lot of different disclosures. A lot of this has been publicly available for a long time, but it wasn't always easy to empirically study the language of these kinds of documents. With modern machine learning and text analysis techniques, we could take a lot of this language, systematically turn it into something quantifiable, and use that to study an interesting question that has been in the literature for a long time. In this case, diversity in how companies are formed. So then moving on from machine learning, that brings us into AI for empirical legal studies. a couple of things I want to say about that. First, there's been a lot of hype and buzzwords around this phrase AI. I think if you just watch the news or see the way that it's talked about, AI seems to mean a million different things, and especially in a lot of business applications, can often get injected as a way to make something sound exciting, and it's not always clear what it is. I would say for our purposes, I think of it as an extension of machine learning that leverages neural networks. So whereas supervised and unsupervised learning has a whole different a bunch of different algorithms that are used, AI, I would say, mainly uses these neural networks. If you've never heard this phrase before, a neural network is essentially a supervised machine learning model where the major innovation is that what it does is it maps inputs to outputs, it makes a prediction, but it tries to mimic the way a human brain would actually function. It basically tries to say when information passes through a neuron, that then sends it to the next neuron, to the next one, to the next one. It's supposed to mimic the way that brains actually learn information and learn to make predictions about the world. And the major innovation is these hidden layers, this multi-layer perceptron network, this hidden layers, these blue circles that you see here. If you've ever heard the phrase black box machine learning, anything like that, that is what's going on, and that's what makes it intelligent. And I'm putting it in quotes, but we could talk about that later. That's the major kind of innovation here, that it learns these patterns in a very highly complex way, and you can make this pattern recognition more and more complex with the introduction of hidden layers that, again, basically represent or basically are meant to simulate the way that human brains are supposed to think. Now, moving beyond that, there are two types within AI that are worth thinking about. The first is discriminative AI. So this would be something like, what is the probability of Y given X equals X? If that doesn't mean anything, don't worry. This is basically the same setup as supervised machine learning. I have some outcome that I want to predict. I want to predict, are you high or low income? And given a set of features like your age, your employment status, your income, your race, things like that, can I make a prediction about what your income actually is? So the same exact setup as what we were talking about with these other supervised machine learning problems. The other major thing that's really taken the world by storm in the last 2 to 3 years, I would say, has been this idea of generative AI. So instead of, can I make a prediction about some outcome based on some features? Instead, what I'm doing is I'm generating random instances of X given a joint probability X and Y. Again, if this isn't super meaningful, don't worry. The basic difference between generative AI and discriminative AI, it is basically what it sounds like in the name, that generative AI lets me create new data in a random fashion instead of trying to make predictions about some sort of outcome. So this is technologies like ChatGPT, Gemini, DeepSeek, etc. All of these examples are generative AI, where I can give it a plain language prompt, and then it spits back some language back at me, or a picture or something like that. It basically creates something new for me to look at, interact with, things like that. So I would say this is where a lot of the current hype is, and where a lot, both in society as well as in legal scholarship, a lot of people have been looking at generative AI and what it could potentially mean. But for your purposes, it's also important to remember that this does not come out of nowhere. It really extends on this kind of suite of tools and these concepts that we're going to build on with machine learning, with text analysis, with discriminative AI, that this all builds on each other, and understanding each bit of this is very important for making sure that you understand both the promises of using generative AI for legal scholarship, as well as some of the limitations of using it, and what it is actually able to do, or the sorts of interesting questions you might be able to answer with these techniques. So I also want to do a little bit of an aside on why generative AI is interesting, and in particular, think about the social science foundations of generative AI. The major kind of innovation with ChatGPT, with DeepSeek, with other models like this, is the ability to create human-sounding text. When I prompt it and I ask a question like, can you summarize this court decision? Can you tell me my rights as a tenant in this contract? Any question like this, or if you even ask it, can you give me a recipe for dinner tonight? The major kind of innovation there is that it's able to give you a human-sounding response that oftentimes people actually like, that they like to interact with. Why does it do this, though? The main reason is that the way that these models were trained was with something called reinforcement learning with human feedback. The essential kind of setup here is that this model would generate output like I talked about. The issue was up till about 3 years ago, when it generated output, oftentimes it would be a little bit nonsensical. Like I said, it's just generating something randomly, given some probability distributions. It would generate something potentially nonsensical or uninformative or just not fun to interact with. So what the engineers at OpenAI and some of these other companies did was instead create this system where output was generated. And then the second step that I've bolded here, that a human annotator basically say whether a response is helpful or not. Was this a nice response or was this not helpful? Was this a bad response? They then do this many, many times, and you get a ranking of how helpful responses actually are. You then take this data, this human labeled data that says this response is helpful, this one is not. You give it back to the model. The model learns, okay, these are good responses, and it gets a reward whenever it generates a good response and receives a punishment when it's not. So it's a little bit like training a dog or something like this. You give it a treat when it sits, you don't reward it when it doesn't, something like that. You do this over and over and over again until eventually these generative AI models learn to produce helpful responses, things that people actually like to interact with. More recently, they've also done what are called reasoning models, where it actually goes through and gives you the way it's thinking through a particular problem. Very similarly, what they had human annotators do was say, was this a logical response? Was it internally consistent? Was it laid out? Was it laid out in an argumentative way? Was it laid out well? Basically, having people actually go and do this sort of labeling so that the model can learn from this. Major thing that I want you to take away from that is that this is actually not that new in terms of social science or science more broadly. In empirical legal studies and in the social sciences more broadly, the choice of how we label data is one of the biggest things that we have to do in any kind of empirical project. Whether I call someone high or low income, for example, that's a choice that I have to make. I have to say, what am I interested in? What is my definition of high and low? And then go from there. When I have people label survey responses, and they say that this survey respondent was talking about one thing or another, or they sounded positive or negative, this person sounded angry or happy. These are all fundamentally social problems, and we oftentimes make assumptions about about how to label these kinds of things. So this is not new. This is something that we have been doing for decades in empirical legal studies and in social sciences. So in some ways, generative AI really is just taking a lot of the kind of computer science infrastructure, a lot of the kind of computational techniques, and adding in what social scientists have been doing for a long time in order to start generating outputs that people actually like to interact with. So again, these social science foundations, it's really important to know just to understand how these products work that you interact with on a daily basis potentially. But beyond that, if we're going to think about how to apply this to social science questions, understanding the way that these models were trained help us also think about how to potentially use them in our own empirical work. So here, there's a ton of research that's going on as well at this kind of frontier of large language models, AI and the law. So for example, a recent paper, Llama, the Power of Specialization for Legal Tasks. This paper asked the question, can large language models outperform research assistants at certain tasks? So probably if you're a PhD student, you have at some point been asked to be a research assistant. Some professor may have asked you, can you label this data for me? Can you label these survey responses? Things like this. So the authors here were interested in, can we get a large language model to do what we normally hire master students or PhD students to sit and label ourselves? And they get some interesting results. They find that GPT-4, it does fairly well, but not as good as human annotators. On the other hand, if you take an open source model like Llama from Meta, and you fine tune this, meaning you give it examples that a human being has actually sat and labeled, then it's actually able to do quite well. It gets in some tasks 95, 97% accuracy. So they go through about 250 different legal tasks and they see how does ChatGPT versus this fine-tuned open source model versus human annotators do at labeling data. And they see a lot of potential for the combination of having human annotators create a data set that you then use to fine tune an open source model. So again, this is a really interesting kind of, we'll see where this goes in the future for empirical legal studies. But this is a really interesting kind of finding in the sense that a lot of empirical legal studies starts with, I have some data and I need to label it. In the future, are we going to still have students do this? Are we going to have the students do a little bit of it? Are we going to have what's going to be the role of humans here? Or are we going to use AI off the shelf to do a lot of this work for us? I would say probably it'll be a combination of the two, but this is something to keep your eye on in the future about where this field is going. So otherwise, I can also talk to you a little bit about some of my own work in this space and how I've been applying some of these methods. So this paper here is called Translating Legalese, Enhancing Public Understanding of Court Opinions with Legal Summarizers. So this is a paper that came out in the Computer Science and Law Symposium last year, 2024. Here, our research question was, can large language models effectively summarize legal documents such as court opinions? So as part of a broader project that we hope to expand to a variety of different legal documents. But here what we did was we took 15 different US Supreme Court opinions across 5 issue areas, and we surveyed a nationally representative sample of people to ask them, do you understand what the court did, how it actually decided this case when exposed to an AI summary versus an expert written one? And also, do you prefer an AI summary over an expert written one? So one written by a lawyer. So here we got some interesting results. When people saw an AI generated summary, 79% were able to say the way that the court decided correctly, whereas only 68% could when exposed to a lawyer written one. We also found subjectively people preferred the quality of AI written summaries. They said that the level of detail, the clarity, and whether they would share it with a friend, all much more likely to do so with an AI generated summary than with an expert written one. So this paper was really as a kind of proof of concept to see, can large language models, which are particularly good at summarization tasks, be used to improve legal accessibility, in this case with court opinions, but again, hopefully expanding into the future. So again, the interesting kind of thing for us here is this idea that this is really cheap, right? Whereas before, to write summaries of legal documents, this is what people go to law school for. You probably spend hours and hours reading cases, writing notes. Can an AI do this much more quickly? Can it do this pretty easily with different prompts and things like this, and at scale? So here we only did a handful of cases. We could imagine scaling up to hundreds or thousands of cases, both in the US and abroad, a variety of different courts, always writing different kinds of legal documents. Can you expand this and make this accessible to people? Again, in a way that they not only understand the law a little bit better, but also just prefer reading it as well. Just to give you a flavor of what this looks like, this is an example of a summary that we were able to generate with AI. Basically, what we do is we ask the AI to summarize a case at a 7th grade reading level, so something like middle school in the US, do it in 10 paragraphs, make it so that we can post on social media potentially, and also define the jargon at the bottom for anybody who's not a legal expert. So here we have a summary of the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and University of North Carolina case. So this came down about 2 years ago now from the US Supreme Court about affirmative action in the US, so university admissions and their consideration of race in their admissions process. So here we had the AI summarize the court's decision. You could see it starts with a summary of what the case was about. It goes through the reasoning a little bit, what the majority of the justices thought was the right outcome, as well as why. And at the end, you can also see that it actually defines a bunch of legal jargon. It puts a star next to it, and it gives a plain language definition for legal terms of art that would not be known to an average lay person. So this is what we are planning to do and planning to expand in a variety of different ways. But this is one thing that's happening with large language models and empirical legal studies right now. This idea of not only studying text as it exists, but actually transforming it and then using that in a variety of ways because of large language models' ability to summarize and change the way that text actually gets represented. There's also exciting possibilities in the use of large language models for what's called multimodal analysis. So again, AI is changing very, very rapidly in the last few years. That when ChatGPT and DeepSeek and these models have been coming out, originally they were very good at working with text in particular, but now they're increasingly able to work with video, images, audio, different types of data that can potentially be analyzed, that can potentially be generated as well. So again, I think one of the exciting things about the AI and the kind of trends it has in social sciences and empirical legal studies is the ability to work with data that would have previously been intractable. So in another working paper I have with my colleague Elliot Ash, the research question we ask is, can AI be used to describe courtroom proceedings? So we have a data set of over 10,000 videos from the US Ninth Circuit's YouTube channel. We also have a bunch of data about the case disposition, who won, who lost, judge characteristics, who appointed them, how long have they been on the court, things like this. And we use a variety of different methods that leverage all of the different kinds of techniques that I've been talking to you about so far. Supervised machine learning to classify who each judge is, as well as their facial expressions, their body language, things like this. Unsupervised learning for audio diarization, meaning separating out who is talking when, and then eventually generative AI for generating transcripts, as well as creating image descriptions, and then this kind of combination of video, audio, and text all together. So to give you a little bit of a preview and a flavor of the sort of thing that is possible when you combine all of these methods together, what I want to do, and I'm gonna put the volume up here, hopefully this works properly.
He was convicted of an aggravated felony, right?
Correct. You have jurisdiction to hear, it's not an asylum, we're not pursuing the asylum case, so the asylum would not. Withholding and Convention Against Torture, we have jurisdiction to hear this matter.
Despite section 1252 A2C, USC.
Well, my understanding is that the appeal, well, and my understanding is that you would have jurisdiction. The only thing the aggravated felony would preclude is filing asylum.
Okay, why don't you take the next minute and a half for the rebuttal and get
the three of us can't do anything about that.
It seems that there is that the court's case law here, despite Judge Graber's interpretation of the various decisions, it appears to say that 242A2C is not applicable to the merits of withholding or CAT. However, the government's position is that the court needs to revisit that issue because those cases in which it's been held in Bromfield and Morales and et cetera are possibly distinguishable, that they possibly that they could be limited to 242A2D issues, and also that the you're most likely familiar with this from the Maldonado case, but that the statute here clearly
I
says.
was
that
on
the court lacks
Maldonado, but it
jurisdiction.
was so long ago, I don't remember it.
Well, and I think, counsel, you clearly preserved the issue. I just think as highly as I think of these two here, I don't think that these two equal 11.
No.
So there's only 3 of us.
All right, so if you know nothing about US law, know nothing about what's happening here, this case is about asylum law and whether or not it was properly used in a particular case, essentially, without knowing any of the kind of substance, though. Show of hands, who thinks, let's figure out who won. Who thinks the one on the left, the first lawyer, who thinks they won? Okay, what about the one on the right? All right, so Ben is correct. Ben, why do you think that the one on the right won? Yeah. Yeah. Cracking some jokes on the right too. She seemed a little annoyed on the left. So you are exactly right. And even with the most basic kind of machine learning models, where here what I have is tracking Judge Wardlaw, the judge right in the center here, tracking her facial expressions throughout the entire video.
The 3.
You can see right around the halfway point, she goes from she goes from kind of neutral, quite angry, kind of towards the middle point. So this is the point where the plaintiff's attorney changes over to the respondent's attorney, and then is quite happy throughout. So even the most basic kind of models are able to pick up on exactly what Ben just picked up, that they were a lot warmer, they were a lot funnier, they were a lot more engaged in the second half. And indeed, the respondent won, the government's attorney won in this case. So again, this is something that intuitively, you can watch a lot of videos. You could go and do this yourself. This would be very hard to study quantitatively. These court proceedings are often 30, 40 minutes long. There are thousands of them at this level at the appellate courts. To study this quantitatively before would have been potentially intractable. With machine learning, even these basic methods, we could say some descriptive things about the judge's facial expressions, their emotions throughout the video, and potentially even make predictions about who won without knowing anything about the substance of this case, about the merits of who should have been right. We could see just from their expressions and how they are interacting. Moving forward, we can go even beyond this and start to do multimodal analysis as well. So instead of just these supervised machine learning methods for who is the judge, how is their facial expression looking, we can actually use large language models to interact with images and video. So here I have a small example for you. I ask a large language model, analyze this courtroom scene with 3 judges presiding over a case. Consider the frames from this frame to that frame, so some particular number of seconds. The attorney said this during that time. And for each one, tell me where that judge is sitting, their body language, their facial expression, any gestures like hand movements, things like that, where they're looking, any changes from the previous frame. So any type of video analysis, we're often going image by image and trying to see what changed from before. And the response to the attorney, how is their facial expression, their body language in response to what is being actually said in front of them. So again, I want you to appreciate there are 3 different things that are going on in this large language model prompt. One, the visual aspects of how the judges and the attorney are behaving, their facial expressions, their body language. 2, the audio, what is being said and the kind of tones and things like this. And 3, the text, the actual substance of what is said. And again, we have techniques for looking at all 3 of these separately. Increasingly, we also have techniques for looking at all 3 of these together. And this is really exciting because this is a lot of the way that we actually experience the world, right? When you're sitting and listening to me talking right now, there are aspects of my body language, there are aspects of my tone, and there are aspects of what I'm actually saying, and all of these are coming together. This is very hard to quantitatively study before, and now we have some tools for actually getting at this. So preliminarily, again, this is a very short preview of ongoing work. We're able to get data that looks like this, that Judge Wardlaw, she's sitting in the center, she's sitting upright, she looks curious, and her response to the attorney, she's considering the implication of the attorney's arguments. Further down, her frown deepens when the attorney discusses the ultimatum. So at some point, he talks about an ultimatum that the government gave to an asylum seeker, or the slight smile suggesting she finds the respondent's attorneys relatable or valid, particularly the reference to the actors in political positions. Basically, there was a joke cracked during the oral argument about Ronald Reagan and other types of actors who went into politics. So again, responding to the actual text and seeing what about her facial expressions and body language how is that responsive to what is actually being said. So again, this is developing. I'm happy to answer more questions about this. But I want to preview for you that this is also possible for you to do too. You will see some kind of starter code. We'll do a couple of exercises, but you'll get a sense of coding all of this stuff is actually not as difficult as you think. It's very learnable. What is difficult is trying to think creatively about what potentially counts as data. Previously, we wouldn't have been able to analyze images, courtroom videos, things like this. We now have tools to do so, but you need to be creative as empirical legal scholars to see, okay, what do I want to learn from this? And can these methods help me learn these sorts of insights? Or can I put things together, invent something potentially that gets at it with the assistance of these different tools? So like I said, I've been talking for a bit. We'll in a moment take a break and then do some coding ourselves, but just a couple of concluding thoughts. So one, particularly if you're a PhD student or just an aspiring empirical legal scholar or an AI empirical legal scholar, a couple of things that I would suggest. First is while you're studying to take courses, do workshops like this or others, go to summer schools, things like this, that help you build certain core competencies. First, in some basic computer programming in language like R or Python, not software like Stata or SPSS, where you're oftentimes working with a graphical user interface. You really want access to these kinds of programming languages because this is where you'll be able to use a lot of these models, a lot of these techniques, and just thinking computationally will help you actually be able to apply these methods to new empirical legal studies problems. Some basic stats course that helps you really get some of these differences between what is a descriptive claim, a causal claim, and a predictive one. Again, they sound easy. It sounds easy when you kind of put these categories in these broad strokes. I would say that a lot of hard thinking goes into this, actually, that you really want to spend some time thinking through and really working on problems that help you clarify for yourself what kind of claim am I actually making here, and can it be supported by the kinds of method that I use, the assumptions that I made, things like this. And again, you really want to go in deep on those frameworks so that you understand them. You can take econometrics and causal inference classes. You could take machine learning. Again, I would say focus not so much on specific techniques. Particular techniques get outdated within a year or two. The techniques that I'm using now in my scholarship did not exist 10 years ago or so when I was taking some of these methods classes, but those frameworks are still going to be relevant, that you still want to understand the theory and basic principles of how these things work, such that when a new technique comes or when there are advances in AI and computation, you're still able to teach yourself new things and then leverage them. You don't want to be tied to a specific toolkit that gets outdated within a couple of years. I think that danger is more present today than it ever was in the last few decades. But these frameworks really matter. And if you understand these principles, you can always teach yourself particular tools later on. Otherwise, I would say try and develop projects, your dissertation perhaps, that helps you advance a lot of these core skills. You can get a lot from classes and workshops and things like this, But really where you start to learn is where you have your own project that doesn't have a super clean data set, that you have to really think hard about in order to get looking a particular way, that you need to make decisions and assumptions and choices about how to label data, how to set up the predictive exercise, things like this. You want to make sure that you get practice with this on a real project that interests you, and that's where you will get learn the most. And within that, I would say, while you're thinking about what that kind of project could be, start getting creative about what might count as data. From your kind of vantage point as kind of junior scholars, one thing that you can oftentimes do is figure out, okay, the literature has had this kind of problem for a very long time, could be years or decades even. Are there things that I'm learning that help me answer these questions in a way that wasn't really possible before? That's one way to go about it, just getting creative about new types of data that can answer some of these old questions. But also thinking through, are there potentially new questions that haven't been thought about before? Maybe in part because it didn't seem methodologically possible, or in part that new gaps in theories or the literature have emerged over years. I would say with this, try and start with a concrete research question rather than a broad topic. So if you're interested in law and technology, for example, it can be very, very difficult if you start with something like, I'm interested in how AI is changing society or the law or something like this. You want to hone in on specific research questions that are tractable and that you could do in a particular project. And again, that will not only be helpful for you to have something to show off later on, but also to develop a lot of these skills. And then I would say, just in terms of professional development, attend conferences and present your work frequently. And there are a couple of good reasons for this. One is half the battle is writing a good paper, doing a good analysis, having nice findings. Of course, that part is important. I would say that you need to also be cognizant of the fact that not everyone reads everything. We all are busy. We all have limited time. Oftentimes, what you are trying to do when you go to a conference and you present a paper is advertising for that paper. You want people to know who you are. You want to be able to talk about it. You want people to pay attention to it. Sometimes they don't read the paper, but they see your presentation, they really like it, and then they go and pick up your paper. Or it drives citations if you want to be more cynical about it. But these kinds of things are important, especially at an early stage, so that you can network and so that you get this kind of practice and that you get your ideas out there so that people are paying attention to them. And with that, I would say make sure you practice writing, presenting, and taking questions early and often. When you go on if you apply for a professorship or you go to industry, a lot of the interview process is really people reading your work, engaging really deeply, asking you tough questions. The more you get practice doing this early on, the easier it'll become and the better off that you'll be. So again, part of doing any kind of data science, any kind of scholarship, is this idea that not only do I have to have interesting results, I also need to know how to talk about them in a way that people find compelling, that people find interesting. I need to be able to tell a story that people will remember. So other than that, just to kind of briefly conclude, like I said, empirical legal studies is a long tradition. It goes back many, many decades. But it wasn't that long ago that it was seen as revolutionary to sit and actually count something and say something quantitatively about the law or legal institutions. We've come quite a long way in terms of the methods and techniques that are oftentimes used. AI gives us a lot of new chances to do a lot of really interesting and cool stuff that wasn't possible before. But this is still part of a bigger tradition where you shouldn't forget some of the basics of empirical legal studies, that it's rooted in good social science, that it's rooted in thinking clearly about the difference between description, causation, and prediction, and in thinking through how human choices and biases and assumptions get baked into any kind of social science design. So that being said, if you're interested in all of this, I think it's a really exciting time because law has so many sources of unconventional data types. Again, we have so much text in the law, perhaps most of the law could be text, some might argue, but also images, audio, various types of sources like this that were not possible to work with before, at least at scale. Oftentimes qualitative researchers might do a little bit with this, but working with this quantitatively has become a really exciting possibility. And again, I would just kind of conclude by saying, We want to complement a strong foundation in law and social science with these kinds of data science skills. You don't want to forget some of these basics or ignore some of these basics, because again, the coding itself is not the hard part. It can be at the beginning, but there's a lot of resources and it's very learnable. These other kinds of things about how to think in a kind of rigorous way is the important part of doing work like this. And then I would say, most importantly, have fun with all of this. I think it's really fun to work with these data. It's really fun to kind of approach this as problem solving and puzzle solving. And it's honestly really satisfying to sit and code something and actually build something that hasn't existed before. So let me go ahead and stop there and maybe take a few questions. Let's dive back in. So has everyone been able to come to this website, or you followed this? Thumbs up. Okay, cool. So let me go ahead and share the screen again. There we go. Okay. All right, so does everybody have this up? You should have the students version. Yes, okay, perfect. Let me know if not, I'll be happy to come around and help out otherwise. Okay, so like I said, what we're gonna do for the balance of this afternoon and then on Wednesday is get our hands dirty a little bit with a bit of code. So a lot of this comes from previous courses that I've taught on computational social science, data science and law, as well as various workshops and things like this. Again, my main goal with this is to show you that all of these kind of projects and these different kind of innovative research ideas that I've been showing you, they're all really learnable, that the code itself should not be scary, that you can also do it too, that you can get started with your own empirical legal work as well. So what we're going to do is work through a little bit of Python to see how some of these things I'm talking about actually get implemented. So just by a show of hands, how many of you have ever dabbled in Python or R or anything like this? All right, I see Ben. Okay. A couple of you. Okay, so I'll go pretty slow and we'll talk at a sort of high level about this. Like I said, oftentimes with coding, the beginning is the hardest. It can be unintuitive in many ways. It can be really, it can seem really challenging. Unlike, let's say, writing a legal paper or a seminar paper or something like this, I would say the main challenge that people run into when they write code is that a computer will get mad and yell at you if you don't punch in the exact right thing. It's very finicky that way. But once you kind of overcome some of these hurdles, then it starts to actually get really fun in many ways. And again, I would say for me, the exciting thing in grad school and kind of developing these skills is the ability to actually start solving some of my own problems by writing code that does this. Okay, so what I want to do is introduce you to this idea of supervised machine learning. And again, please stop me at any point with any questions. This is really meant to be beginner friendly. If you don't get it all right now, that's totally okay. I will share the notebook and everything like that so that you have time to practice and go through this yourself as well. Okay, so when you start with any kind of computational project, you need to be able to write code and you need to kind of arrange things. What I have here is a notebook written in a piece of software called Google Colab. So if you have a Google account, then you can actually go into a Google Drive and create a new Colab notebook whenever you like. And this actually lets you just write Python code right there. You don't need to run it on your computer. You don't need to install anything. Just in your web browser, you could start working directly with Python. So what I have here is a notebook that kind of walks you through all the way from reading a data set in and through developing your own supervised machine learning model. So let's go ahead and get started. Anytime you start a project like this, what we want to do is first load in a bunch of software. So whenever you're working with Python, or if you're familiar with R or anything like this, usually what you do is work with what are called software libraries that let you do all sorts of different things. So for example, Pandas is the way that you can work with data frames, or basically, if you've ever seen an Excel workbook, a kind of spreadsheet, that lets me work with spreadsheets in Python, for example. sklearn, scikit-learn, this is our main machine learning software. So this is what's going to let us train machine learning models and eventually deploy them. And then here, I have a couple of libraries that let me do some plots. So again, you will be able to explore this and play with this on your own. So go ahead and hit Shift Enter or Shift Return on this first cell, and it will go ahead and import all of these different software libraries. Yes. The link, of course, yes. So let me pull that up again. Here we go. Okay, so there it is. Give a few seconds to get that back. Everyone good? Solid. Okay. So I'll stop my share again. And we should be back. Great. So if you hit Shift Return or Shift Enter, you can go ahead and import all of the software that you need. Then what we want to do is start actually working with some data. So here, what I do is I've linked you to the data that we're going to be working with. This is the US Census data, the one that I previewed in that slide deck before. I'm going to go ahead and say, here's the URL to the data. Here are all of these different column names that's in the data. And then read in this data from the URL and give the column names these ones that I've specified. So I've already done all of this work for you, which makes this a bit easier. On your own projects, this is the sort of thing that you would spend some time getting started. Get my data in, make sure the columns are all labeled properly, things like that. So I'm going to go ahead, Shift Enter. So I loaded in the data. And then I can go ahead and take a look at it. So anytime in Python, when I'm working with any kind of data set, Python uses what are called objects, and these objects get manipulated with functions and methods. So here, I loaded in my data and I called it census. Then I said, I want to look at the first 5 rows of my data set called census. So I say census, period. That basically means I'm about to use some kind of method on this census object. And here I'm going to use head. So what that basically says is take this data set called census and look at the first 5 rows. Again, so the basic logic is here's an object and a method. And the method does something to the object. In this case, shows me the first 5 rows. So we could take a look. I have a bunch of information here, age. Are they working for the state? Are they self-employed? Are they working for private industry? What is their level of education, marital status, number of hours they work per week, capital gains, whether they have capital gains taxes, things like this. And ultimately what we want to do is predict their income bracket. Do they make less than or equal to $50,000 or more than $50,000? Okay. That's basically what supervised machine learning is trying to do, but we need to take a few steps before we actually get to the machine learning part. So in particular, doing data pre-processing. How do we actually get the data ready to start doing some modeling on it? What here we want to do is basically think through some substantive questions. What kinds of features should I include? Should I include working class? Should I include both education, years of education and highest degree attained? Should I include variables like race or sex? These are partially substantive questions. Sometimes they're technical questions. If something's not predictive, we may not want that in the data set when we try and train the machine learning model. We also want to then think about what is the best model. And then finally, how do we evaluate the model? How do we pick the most accurate one? Let's start by thinking about the features. So again, features are anything I'm using to eventually predict the target or the outcome. So if the target is income status, the features are anything else that I'm using to make that prediction. So here, what I did is I said census D types. So that tells me the type of data. So notice here, I have a few things. So it says age, int 64, work class object, final weight in 64, education object. just kind of looking at this, what do you think the difference is between the ones that say int64 and object? Please, yeah. That's the number of bits, but that's exactly right. But the integer is the number. So then what are the objects then? Yeah, so that's exactly right. So here it's some kind of string, it's categorical, state gov, private, self-employed, not included, blah, blah. So here we have some numbers and then we have some categories. Remember what I said earlier, that a lot of getting things ready for machine learning is quantifying things that are not already quantified. So these categories, like what is your highest level of education? What is your, do you work for the state or do you work for a private company? These are not numbers by themselves, right? A computer cannot already work with this. So what we oftentimes have to do is get this into a format that can then be read by the machine so that we could pass this through to an algorithm. So let's go ahead and make that happen. What we'll do is we'll first binarize the target. So we will go ahead and take less than or equal to 50,000 and more than 50,000 and make these into zeros and ones. So again, the machine needs to be able to see some number that it ultimately wants to predict. I'm going to go ahead and say 0 and 1. So again, I create this label binarizer. I then apply it to my income bracket. I create a new column called income bracket binary. Now notice less than 50,000 is a 0. More than 50,000 is a 1. Okay. Any questions so far? Again, if you're completely new to coding in Python, it's totally okay. You can practice with all of this later, but part of what I want you to see is basically with a couple of different steps, I can get to a spot where then this becomes possible to feed to a computer. But one of the kind of conceptual hurdles that you need to overcome is making sure that you understand how the computer thinks in some way. That whereas I can read this table and I can see the categories and I can kind of reason through them, a computer needs it in a particular format for it to actually be able to work with this data. So, like I said, these categories by themselves can't be fed through. So instead, what we do is we dumbify them. We also turn these into a series of zeros and ones. So I'm going to go ahead and run this line of code here, which basically says get dummies, create these dummies for these columns here. And let's go ahead and take a look at the first 5 rows. So now notice it says working class question mark. So if it's missing, false. Working class federal government, false, false, false. Native country Portugal, false, 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 blah, blah. So what I've basically done is instead of any of these columns having, say, 3 categories or 100 categories or something like that, I've basically said we're going to dumbify them. We're going to say, is this true or is this false? So if I run this line of code here, I ask for the dimensions of my new data frame. So I have 32,000 rows and 110 columns versus my original data frame, 32,561 rows again, and 16 columns. So what do you think? By doing this dumbified thing, I've created these dummies, these zeros and ones. This is true or this is false. For example, working class, federal government. These are all false, but if it's true, then it would say true instead. Did I change anything about the data or did I just change the way it was presented? Who thinks I changed the data? Who thinks I just changed how it's presented? Okay, great. So that's exactly right. This is one of the kind of core problems with machine learning. That what I've now done is I've taken the same data that otherwise was in 16 columns and I've now spread it across 110 columns. This becomes computationally more difficult. I have now nearly, 7 to 8 times as many columns that I have to work with. The data now looks a lot bigger. It takes longer to actually compute, to actually work with when I feed it to the model. That then gets us to two core machine learning concepts. One is the idea of the cursive dimensionality, and the other is the idea of sparsity. Cursive dimensionality basically means as I add more and more columns, I add more dimensions, but that also makes my data more and more complicated, and it takes longer to run. It takes the algorithms get more complex. So this is a big problem, and oftentimes in machine learning, we're trying to reduce the number of columns in order to address this curse. The other kind of main payoff from this is the more columns I have, the more rows I typically need, meaning the more number of observations I need in order to make good predictions. The problem is that as I increase the number of columns, I don't just need 30 more rows. I oftentimes need an exponential number increasing. So we oftentimes want to reduce this number. The other big problem here is sparsity, meaning most of my data is actually empty. So you actually see that in practice here. Notice how everything basically says false. In Python, that false translates to zeros, which means that nothing is there, that is empty. So sparsity is a problem. I now have this massive data set, but it's mostly zeros. And this is one of the core problems that I'm dealing with, that this is a big data set. It's mostly not actually meaningful. I'm trying to pick out the couple of meaningful truths from here out of what is otherwise a really big number of zeros. So a lot of what we end up doing in applied machine learning in any kind of AI work is trying to work through this problem. How can I meaningfully reduce the number of columns that I have and basically deal with a lot of these zeros such that when I have a big data set, I can actually run this in a reasonable amount of time. Questions so far? Okay. The other big picture thing that I want you to take out from this kind of intro to supervised learning is data splitting. So again, I don't really think you need to have this code memorized. I don't think you need to have this syntax. I want you to walk away with some of these big picture concepts. That one of the problems is this cursive dimensionality and sparsity. Another is this idea of data splitting, that the big difference between machine learning and other types of statistics. A lot of times, if you've taken an intro stats course or something like that, you will run a regression or you will do a statistical test on a whole data set. With machine learning, what we usually do is split into training and test data. The reason for this is the problem that you see here, called the bias variance trade-off, where essentially, when I train a machine learning model, because they tend to be so accurate, they tend to learn all the idiosyncrasies, all the unique things about the data set that they are trained on. They then don't generalize super well. So earlier we were talking about training a machine learning model to, for example, predict corruption in Brazilian municipalities. The problem is that if I don't hold out some data, it's pretty good at predicting within that data set. If I give it a new municipality, the accuracy drops significantly. So the way that I deal with this then is split part of my data into a training set where I actually train the model, and then part of it into a test set where I then evaluate how accurate is my model for data it has never ever seen before. The reason being that you could have a couple of different ways that a model might go. It could be underfit. So on the left-hand side here, you could see how I have a bunch of data. It goes in a bit of a U shape. If I do a very simple model that's just a line, it gets pretty good. It captures a lot of it, but I miss some of these data points up here. I miss some of these data points up here. I miss some of these down here. The tendency with machine learning models is that they are more complicated, but therefore prone to this overfitting. They try and capture every single data point. So notice how I'm getting basically everything. Now the problem is when I get a new data point that's added to this, the model is going to have a very hard time predicting it. So imagine there was a new data point right over here. Hopefully you can see that. Yes, right over here. The model would not be able to predict something like that if there was just slightly outside what the most recent one was. So this tendency to overfit is a big problem with machine learning, and we want to try and correct for that. So instead, what we're often aiming for is this one that's balanced. So notice how I capture the nice U shape. I don't hit every single point, but I capture the general relationship between my X and Y. And that's ultimately what I'm going for, that I want the general relationship, not let me try and fit to every single point as well as I can, because then this is going to not work when I give it a new data point outside of what it's been trained on. Questions? So this is a lot at once, so stop me at any point. With that, we can actually go ahead and train a machine learning model. So go ahead, and if you're still following along with me here, run this line of code here. So what I've done is I've repeated transforming my target, my census income bracket into zeros and ones. Then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to drop it, and I'm going to save everything else in X. So I remember I said that machine learning, supervised machine learning, is all about predicting some Y from this set of X's. So I'm going to put that all in X, get dummies, X head. So we have the data that the features we're going to use to predict. We're just about to train our first machine learning model, but let's go ahead and see one thing really quickly. So here I've plotted the number of high income and the number of low income people in my data set. The number of low incomes are the zeros, the number of high incomes are the ones. Just looking at this, what do you think a problem might be? Let me put it this way. If I wanted to train a very simple model where every single time I predicted that somebody is low income, that's the rule that I use. I'm just going to predict everybody is low income. Would I do pretty good on accuracy? Probably north of 70% or so, right? Not actually horrible. It's not great. There'll still be a lot of errors, but just predicting everybody as low income, I would get more than half right. The problem with this is that this isn't a good way to make substantive decisions, right? Or substantive predictions about anything. Just kind of predicting the most popular kind of outcome. So this is another tendency machine learning models will have. Again, what they're trying to do is just minimize error or just be right as often as possible. So there's a tendency to just guess whatever the most popular option is. And this is another thing that we need to correct for. So knowing this, there are techniques for dealing with these kinds of imbalances and making sure that we penalize just guessing low income all the time. I got a 70% accuracy, I'm all good. So another thing to kind of keep in mind, any kind of real world data set is usually not going to be 50% one thing, 50% another. So with that, how does this actually all work in practice? So I've already noted to you a couple of key issues. And again, the issues that I'm mentioning, these are also true for the way that generative AI gets trained. It's true for a lot of the more complex kinds of examples as well. So how do we actually go ahead and approach this? They overfit on the data that they're trained on. They tend to they tend to guess the majority class too much. We have these cursive dimensionality. Can we go ahead and solve this with code? Luckily, yes, these are all well understood problems, and we have a lot of software that handles a lot of these problems for us. So go ahead and run this cell if you're following along with me. And what we do here is do exactly what I said about data splitting. I'm going to take all of my X's, I'm going to take all my Y's, I'm going to split them first into a training and a validation set, and then further into a test set. So oftentimes when you're doing any kind of legal policy or public policy analysis with machine learning, not only will you just do a train and test split, you'll do a train and a validation split. So you can keep going back and forth between the training and validation. And the test you leave for the very, very end. You only do one prediction there. And that's oftentimes what you'll hand over to a policymaker, to the government, to a client, anyone like this, so that you could say, this is how accurate my model is on data that I have never seen before that is completely untouched. So that's exactly what we're doing here. So we'll run that, and then we'll go ahead and actually train our very first machine learning model. So one of the most basic types of models that we can use is what's called a decision tree classifier. What this basically is a series of if-then statements. So here is a classic example of trying to predict a type of flower. So you start with some rule, petal length is less than or equal to 2.45. If that's true, you go down here and you guess setosa. If it's false, you then check, is petal length less than 1.75? If true, go down here. If false, go down here, so on and so forth. So these are actually quite popular in legal applications, particularly in areas where the law is structured as a series of if-then. So a lot of tax scholars, for example, will do something like this. If you make below $50,000 a year, then your marginal tax rate is say 15% or something like that. If you make more than 50,000 but less than 75,000, the marginal tax rate might be 17% or effective tax rate 17%. A lot of law that gets structured as if-then statements can be very easily modeled like this. The key thing with machine learning is I don't have to set and pre-specify a lot of that. I can actually have the data tell me what the best rules are for creating this series of if-then statements. So go ahead and run this cell right here. So what we do is we're going to create an algorithm, a decision tree classifier. These are all called hyperparameters. So these are different settings that I can toggle on and off or give different options to for how I want the model to be trained. I'm not going to go too much into depth with this. If I was teaching a full course, we would spend quite some time on each one of these. But take my word for it that these are all different settings that can matter for how the model gets trained. And now if you're still following along, go ahead, run that cell right there where I have this decision tree classifier. And remember, anytime in Python I want to do something, I take my object, I take my method after the period. So I'm going to say fit on X train, so my features, Y train, my target. So I'm telling it, take my features, predict my target, and fit, meaning create a model, a decision tree model that maps these features to my target. And let's go ahead and print. And I get a score of 1. So if you've been following so far and you've ran these two cells, congratulations, you've run your first machine learning model. You're ready to be an AI engineer. But thinking back to what I've been saying so far, so the score is how accurate it is. So I'm saying 1.0 accuracy. Before I run the next one, what's the problem? It says 1.0. Do you believe it? Do you believe I have 100% accuracy? See a couple no's. So probably not. So this is what I was talking about. The machine learning models tend to be very accurate in the data that they are trained on. But as soon as you go outside of that, they tend to lose some accuracy. So remember, I created this validate data set. So the model has not seen it all. We're going to do some predictions here. We're going to say predict within this validation set. And here I have 0.82. That's not bad. 82% of the time, I guess the income bracket correctly, whether you're low income or high income. But notice that's a pretty big drop off, right? In my training data, I'm 100% accurate. Every prediction I made, I got right. But as soon as I went to new data, that dropped off 18.5%, basically. Still pretty good. 4 out of 5 times I'm right. But my model is much less accurate on new unseen data. So again, this is the major issue that we're oftentimes trying to solve with machine learning. And if I'm doing this in any kind of empirical legal setting, That can be a huge difference, right? The 19% difference, that could be, I've successfully audited whatever I needed to and found every single example of corruption, or I missed like a fifth of them and wasted a ton of money. So that's the fundamental problem that we're often addressing here, and the one that we are trying to correct for oftentimes, this tendency to do this overfitting. Any questions? Okay. So I'll show you a couple more things before we, oh, is that a question? Oh, no, okay. A couple more things before we break and then come back to this on Wednesday. The other kind of big thing for empirical legal studies particularly is oftentimes we need to be able to explain what we are doing to policymakers, to legal audiences, etc. So one of the challenges with machine learning is that oftentimes it can be a black box or it could be inscrutable. You need to be able to explain in some basic terms what it is that your model is doing or how it picked up on different correlations. So one thing that's really nice about things like a decision tree is I can actually plot out the entire kind of logical path. Oftentimes, even when it's more complicated than that, I can do things like look at which of the model features were most important. So what was the most predictive for helping me figure out whether or not someone is low or high income? Here we could see their marital status, if they're married or have a civil union. This was very predictive. Their number of years of education is very predictive. Their age is very predictive. Again, none of this is causal, right? Being older does not cause you to have a higher income. Being married doesn't cause you to have a higher income. But these can be predictive in ways that we can imagine, right? That people with higher incomes might tend to get married at higher rates. People with higher incomes may have been saving for a very long time. We could imagine all sorts of stories like this, and they can oftentimes cut both ways. With machine learning, we don't really care if the feature causes a higher or low income status. We just care if it's highly correlated or in a way that it can be useful for making strong predictions about it. And again, this is the kind of thing that oftentimes policymakers that other scholars would like to see as well, because they want some kind of story that can go along with the results and not just a simple number. I'm 100% accurate or I'm 85% accurate. Do you have a question? Oh, okay. So then the very last thing that I will show you here is a popular tool that we have for visualizing how well we're doing. And this is called the confusion matrix. So whenever we're doing any kind of classification problem, we're often interested in not just that overall accuracy, that 83%, but am I good at predicting particular categories or not? So here on the x-axis, I have predicted label, low and high income, less than 50,000, greater than 50,000, versus the true label, greater than 50,000, less than 50,000. Each square is basically the intersection. So when someone is predicted to be low income and they're actually low income, I get these about 87% of the time. When they're predicted to be high income and they're actually high income, I get these about 64% of the time. So again, thinking back to the imbalanced class problem, I have a lot more low income folks than high income ones in this data set. You could see how we get into this kind of challenge as well. It's pretty easy to just keep guessing low income, and the model almost wants to do that because it'll be right more often than not, but at the expense of this other category. So you can imagine in a practical application, I'm trying to, for example, audit high income individuals in, say I'm the IRS, I'm trying to audit high income individuals. If I'm less accurate in predicting those, then my audits are actually not going to be that effective. I'm going to miss a lot of people who I otherwise would be able to get, or who I otherwise would want to audit. Okay, so let me go ahead and stop there. We will pick up again on Wednesday. We'll do a little bit of this. I will also show you a bit more kind of text analysis and generative AI as well. So we might jump around a bit, but I'll make sure to circulate all these materials as well so that you're free to practice on your own. Okay, so with that, thanks for joining me. This is super fun, and we'll pick up next time. Thank you, everyone.